house rules really. Just to let everyone know that we will be recording this event and it'll be streaming live on YouTube as well. So if you don't want your face on the recording, then knock your camera off, because of course that we will put that out there on social media once the event is done as well. Just let you know, so if you could follow us on Twitter, that would be great. So I think someone will put something in the chat, and everything we refer to this evening as well, any Labour manifesto, anything like that, there will be some links put in the chat for you to follow as well. Any of the panel, if they mention anything, we'll do our best to find it on Google. So you've got a quick link to that as well. We're also on Facebook as well, so if you can follow UBI Lab Wales on Facebook, that would be great. If you're following the event on Twitter and Facebook, it's hashtag UBI Wales, and if you're tweeting about it or posting about it, then if you could use that hashtag as well, it'd be great if we could tie up the event as well. Just to let you know, so we're running a campaign at the moment, which is the Pledge for UBI campaign, and all of our fabulous panelists this evening have signed up to that. So thanks very much for that, guys. And if you want to have a look at that, you can find that on the UBI Lab Network website, or you can have a look on Twitter. It's pinned on our profile. You can have a look at that. You can see who has signed that, and if your candidates in your area, for example, have signed up to it. And if they haven't, of course, give them a nudge to do that. There's also a public pledge that you guys can sign up to as well. So please do that. And again, that's on the thread that we've pinned on our page. So going to our candidates then. So this evening we have candidates for Welsh Labour, and we're incredibly pleased to be joined by them this evening. It's really excited. It's the final event as well. So we hope this is a really good one. No pressure, guys. So I'll introduce Dawn first, Dawn Bowden, who is the constituency candidate for Merthyr and Rumney. Secondly, we've got Mick Anthony, who is the constituency candidate for Pontypridd. We also have Rhiannon Passmore, who is the constituency candidate for Islwyn. And last but not least, we have Jack Sargent, who is the constituency candidate for Allen and Deeside. So that's our panel. I'm Jonathan Williams, and I'm a co-founder of UBI Lab Wales. And thank you very much, everyone, for attending this evening. So it's going to be an informal chat. We're going to ask a few questions to the panel, and then after that, we'll open it up to the audience. If you want to ask your question, you can turn off your camera and you can be invited to unmute yourself and you can ask the question yourself. Or if you want to put some questions in the chat, then the chats are usually pretty lively with these events. So please engage with that. And like I said, we'll pop in some links as well. And it's really great to have a discussion in there and bounce a few ideas off each other. So I'm going to get cracking with the first question. And I'm going to throw the first question to Jack. And Jack, I just wanted to ask, really, when was it that you heard about a universal basic income? And when did you decide that this was an idea that we need to pilot?
Well, Jonathan, thank you for that. And thank you for letting me be here this evening. It's great to be here with my good friends and colleagues as well. So good evening to everyone. I've spoken about a universal basic income for a couple of years now. And I've been in the Senedd for just over 3 years, and it was one of those things I sort of was made aware of in the very early days. And it was from then when I started to speak about it. And I considered that a UBI mainly because of the huge shifts in our economy. And if we look particularly to my area of Allen and Deeside in North East Wales, climate change was clearly an issue for everyone, but also automation. And I think there's a report out there somewhere, and you're marvellous to find it now. It was a few years ago and the BBC reported that my constituency would be the worst hit. Now, coming from industry, that I want automation. I believe in automation, but we have to do it the right way. We have to have cobots not robots. So that was the main sort of driver for me getting really interested in that. And one of the reasons why I wanted to see something different, like a UBI, was because the community where I'm from and always have lived, we saw devastation in the 80s and I have to say, under the Thatcher government, in the closure of the steelworks, the single most biggest redundancy in a single day in Europe. And we still face that issue now. We still see the devastation now in our communities. And I feel that's where the UBI could perhaps help. So that was my initial interest. And then since then, I've had, the time to speak to many people. We organised an event, with the Future Generations Commissioner and some academics. We've done some stuff with yourself and your network as well, including UBI Lab Youth, which was fantastic. And then the more I looked into a UBI and the idea of a trial initially in Wales, a UBI for Wales, I realised then that actually it could really help get through some of the problems we see in society daily. So some serious issues, like domestic violence for one, the impact on the attainment gap. And then if we look, we always talk about lifelong learning. Well, I think, UBI could help with assist with that and move forward, allowing people the opportunity to progress and upskill. So I think I'll leave it there for the open. Now, plenty to say. And you said about links. Well, I've written a couple of stuff on this. There's a piece on Labour List, which sort of gets the ball rolling about my initial thought. And then there's also a piece for the Institute of Welsh Affairs, which talks about why I think a UBI could be helpful for those domestic abuse survivors and how they. So they're two niche areas which I think may be interest of people watching.
Yeah, and we'll certainly get the links in the chat. There's the first one there. Liam's on the ball with that one. Thanks very much, Liam. Good stuff. So, Dawn, if I could bring it over to you after Jack's brilliant start. How about you? When did you first hear about it, and when did you realise it was something we should pilot?
Okay, well, thanks for that, Jonathan. And again, thanks for the invite to come along this evening. So, I suppose my first kind of inkling around UBI, and I don't know that I even knew what it was called then, to be honest, was before I came into the Senedd. So before I came into the Senedd, I was a full-time official with Unison. And I was involved with Mark Drakeford, actually, First Minister, who was then the Minister for Health. And I was leading the negotiations, the pay negotiations back in 2014 when we negotiated, and it was one of, a very proud achievement of mine that I led negotiations on introducing the living wage into the NHS in Wales, the first nation of the UK to have done so at a time when our colleagues in England were actually striking on pay, and we managed to negotiate the living wage. And that kind of came from a joint understanding between the trade unions here and the government, and the Minister at the time, as I said, was Mark Drakeford, really looking at what do we do to ensure that people can have a basic income that enables them to live, hence the term the living wage. And so that was the first time that I started to sort of think about that the living wage, or a basic income that enables people to live, was part of what we were doing in those negotiations, I guess. And then when I was elected to the Senedd, much like Jack, I started to see what was happening in my casework. And, representing a constituency like Merthyr Tydfil and Rumney, where we have some communities here that are levels of deprivation that are not just the worst in Wales, but some of the worst in the UK and Europe, actually. And so it started to get me thinking that, the current system of welfare, and certainly universal credit and so on, just wasn't working for people in my constituency. And so that there had to be something better than that. And again, like Jack, I did an article, and I don't think I've got the link for this actually, so I don't know whether your researchers can get onto that fairly quickly, but I did an article for the Fabians in 2018, I think it was in April 2018, and I talked in there about the state of well-being in Wales, and it came on the back. I won't take full credit for it because it came on the back of an article that my colleague Jeremy Miles had done when he talked about, you know, Bevan being the architect of the welfare state, and that this generation needed to be looking beyond that now into the well-being state. And so I did an article around that where I was looking at what a well-being state might look like, and I wanted to explore how the tradition of a welfare state might evolve if well-being is now a more common and shared purpose, which it seems to be. And I was writing then about a minimum income guarantee. So again, you know, living wage, universal basic income, we'll call it what you will. But I was looking in that article at a minimum income guarantee, and I was also looking at the possibility of topping up welfare payments, so that people that were experiencing particular or difficulties that could be short-term and overcome could have welfare benefits topped up. So I'm thinking of, you know, when people were in periods of stress, depression, debilitating kind of conditions like that. So that's kind of where my sort of interest in UBI came, was really just looking at people having a guaranteed basic income to be able to live on.
Thanks, Dylan. And it's really interesting. So you obviously, you know, come into this from a trade union perspective, and,
yeah.
and myself, I was a trade union representative for GMP, and
Okay.
and it's where I actually started with this idea as well. So really interesting parallels.
Yeah.
And so how about you, Rhiannon? What about yourself? When did you first come into this?
Well, I suppose in regards to my involvement in politics, that's always been spawned, is not a nice word, but from a belief in the fact that we need a fairer system across the UK, specifically, obviously, in Wales, but we need to make sure that we are propagating fairer taxes and a fairer income base across the UK in particular. And we have to be absolutely blunt about this. We have a very broken welfare system. We have, in a sense, a system that is no longer a safety net for the most weakest and vulnerable in our society. It is absolutely appalling that the UN sent in a poverty raconteur to investigate what is going on in terms of disability assessment. So let's start from the very beginning, as Julie Andrews said, we do not have a proper welfare system across the UK anymore. I think it's absolutely appalling that the working tax credit threshold has been diminished, the fact that we have the bedroom tax, the fact that we have a myriad of different attacks on our welfare state. So we have to understand at the very beginning of this debate that we could be doing far more to improve incomes from a UK level. In regard to why I am interested in this, it's purely because I want fairness. I believe in redistribution. It is absolutely wrong that we have a taxation system whereby we are rewarding those at the very top and penalising those at the very bottom. And anything that is going to create a fairer system for people, I am interested in. And I'm really interested in piloting for groups that we know are suffering, particularly from deprivation, whether it's care leavers. I'm interested in what Jack has said in terms of domestic abuse victims. We have very clear groups of people across the UK and within Wales also, where we can actually target a pilot very, very usefully. But I also think, if I may, in regards to the situation around the deprivation that we suffer, especially in mining and coal and steel former communities that I think Jack has already alluded to, suffering from ill health, the WIMD data. We know all about the fact that there are pockets of poverty, that objective 1, 2, 3 and 4 and 5 in terms of European structural funding catered to. Now, we are still waiting for those replacements from the UK government. The fact that my area in Caerphilly has not had the community renewal levelling up allocation that is the precursor to the shared prosperity fund is something that the UK government has to step up and sort out. So my interest in this as a pilot is we've already got those geographical areas now. We know what's objective 1, we know what's objective 2. Let's use the data we've got and let's have this experiment. But we do also have to look at this in the round. In regard to child benefit, in regard to furlough, in regard to pensions, we know that the model is out there for something that is universal. But equally, the UK has a huge part to play in this, and the Welsh Senate's functionality is also a big issue in this regard as well.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right in terms of, in particular in South Wales, we have so many. I come from RCT myself. We have so many towns that are left behind due to, as Jack alluded to, Thatcherism and deindustrialization. So I think in particular, a pilot, it would be very interesting to see the impact that it has in those areas and whether or not it actually reinvigorates those local economies. So I think you touched on something very important there, Rhian, and it's very good to hear you say that. And last but not least, Mick, how about yourself?
Yeah, it's actually quite a difficult question, because it depends what you mean by UBI. The issue of a minimum income and the necessity of a minimum income as being the way in which you guarantee people are out of poverty. I mean, it goes back really to the 18th century. I mean, Thomas Paine wrote about it, talked about it. Economists in the 30s, 40s and 50s wrote about it. I think what is new is the term UBI has come into being, but certainly in the 70s, we were talking about the issue of guaranteed minimum income. What has brought it to the forefront more now, I think, is this. I think the welfare state that was set up, the benefit system that was set up, at a time when you had almost full employment, there was always work for people. There was also work for whatever your qualifications levels were. There was always a place for you, those with learning difficulties. So there was always somewhere in a sort of environment that was quite often organised that people could work in. And as that began to change, I think the complexity of the benefit system began to change. And it certainly began to change very drastically with Thatcher, when really you had the first real move away by government from the concept of abolition of poverty and equality. And of course, in the last decade, we've had the issue of austerity. And of course, austerity has meant that there's been a very different approach to people on benefits. We suddenly have concepts of the deserving poor, the shame of being on benefits. Benefits aren't there so you can have a good life or have a decent life, even benefits, etc. And the various, I think, vilification of that, really, when it comes down to a state that has been incapable of providing people with employment. And so, the idea of a guaranteed minimum income has been around a long time. I know we discussed it when the Bevan Foundation, I was one of the founder members of the Bevan Foundation, was formed. I think what has changed in the last couple of years is that the consequence of all those employment changes and social changes and 10 years of austerity and the real driving up of the vilification of people on benefits has actually really highlighted the issue of what do we need to do about poverty, and really the missed opportunity we had, because the reform of benefits and universal credit to some extent was about the whole concept of reforming a complex system that actually guaranteed people a decent baseline in terms of their living, tied in with employment and everything else. And so universal credit has actually become the exact opposite almost of what it was intended to be. And that is really the tragedy of the missed opportunity. And as we've had, I think, increased poverty and the highest levels of inequality developing, the rich getting richer, a society of working people where working people are increasingly without any rights and benefits. The whole concept of doing something really radically different has emerged. And I think for us, the challenge now is to define precisely what we mean by it. How might we do it? Might we be talking about the overall system? How might a trial work? What would a trial be? I've always come back to the thing of saying, look, I actually think to some extent within part of our system, we already have the basis of it, because we say within the tax system that you have a £12,000 tax limit, non-taxable start. So everybody is saying shouldn't be paying any tax on the first £12,000, because that's the minimum that you actually need, really, as a basis for living. Well, the only problem is that only applies to people who are in work, and if the state can't guarantee work for those for others, then why do we actually treat them differently? So I think there's a lot of detail that really needs to be worked out. I do worry a little bit that there's a tendency to say UBI that it's a silver bullet for this, and almost that it's a sort of oven-ready deal, whereas in reality, getting a trial is really the first step to really thinking practically how we might actually, in an area, impact upon it, what we would do. And it's good. So obviously the Senate has passed a motion in support. Really great that Mark Drakeford, the First Minister, has said he wants to see a trial. Really good that RCT Council and other councils have said they want a trial. But I think the devil is going to be in the detail. It's going to be working out what we do. What I think is clear, though, is that we've got to do something different if we really want to abolish poverty. And the concept of UBI opens the door to our thinking and our processes for beginning to design the various options around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're quite right, Mick, in that, it isn't a silver bullet, this. And I think that people need to be aware of that, we still need to be fighting for better housing, improved services in healthcare, for example, mental health services. But I think that what's important about a UBI is that it's a foundation upon which we can all build up from, and it's a 21st century solution to 21st century problems. And I think that it's a good place to start. Absolutely. So moving on to the second question, which was very exciting. We see Mark Drakeford, of course, in the Senate debate recently mentioned this when asked about UBI. So going on from that, we've mentioned that you mentioned that in the debate, and I suppose what I would like to know is a little bit more about what Mark Drakeford was talking about with regards to experimenting this idea with care leavers, and I know that you, Jack, have mentioned this in your, I think it was a BBC Radio 4 interview, was it BBC Today, that you mentioned this. It's a really interesting concept. So I'll start with you, Jack, if that's okay, given that you've mentioned this before, and if you could give us a bit more into that, that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, of course, Jonathan. I think it's pretty clear, isn't it, that it was great to see the other night, wasn't it, the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, lead the way and say that's what he would do if elected. I think it is pretty clear that Mark is passionate about ensuring that everybody, no matter who you are or where you come from, has a fair chance in life. And I think if you take a step back really and look at his previous career before frontline politics, I think that is an area and a theme that clearly runs through it. It's embedded in him. So I wasn't surprised that he said what he said during the ITV leaders debate. And the issue, particularly on care leavers and the trial for them, a universal basic income trial, is something that I've spoken with Mark about following the motion when it was debated in the Senate when I led that. It seems forever ago now, but it wasn't too long ago. So we had a conversation on that, and I think it was an area that we were both interested in. The idea that a trial we need to learn all these complexities, and Mick has just mentioned some of those in his previous answer. How does it work with the current welfare system? Is it needed to be completely separate to it? Can it work within it? Those are some of the answers that obviously we want to get from a trial. And there's many trials, as you know, and everyone on this call knows, across the world. But the one in Wales, and in particular the care leavers, I think it was something that's close to my heart and my colleagues on the call, that it not only should find out those complex answers that we need to have to make a universal basic income possible in the future, but it should actually be there to support a group of people who need it most. And I think care leavers in particular fall into that bracket. There's many other people as well, but care leavers in particular do fall into that bracket, and it's an opportunity. And I have an area of interest in adverse childhood experiences and how trauma and we should inform our policy decisions on trauma. And, you know, going back where I, you know, use my kind of politics sort of saying, well, that is actually about trauma-informed decision-making, trauma-informed decision-making, not only for politicians and governments to make, but actually systems, and the welfare state is clearly one of them. We know, don't we, Rhiannon and Dawn have said it tonight, that the current system is not good enough. It's poor, it's not flexible, and it's really, really hard for someone who's gone through a trauma or traumatic experience in life to trust that system, because it fails them completely. And I think that's where we need to be different, kinder. I think that's where the UBI falls into, to support those people who've had a difficult life, to give them that support they might need, but also, and the foundation that you talked about. But I actually think it's a little bit further. I think you're right, Jonathan, to mention that this isn't a silver bullet, like Mick said. It's one area of policy that needs to be implemented with many other areas of policy, but it does give people that springboard as well. So I think it's a UBI trial on care leavers, like the Mark Drakeford said in that debate. There's two reasons for it, isn't there? There's one's to find out those answers that we need, and I'm not going to pretend I know those answers, because it's a, you know, that is it's a real challenge to find out how those work. And I'm sure there'll be lots of officials who are a lot more cleverer than me in this area, but actually at the same time supporting those people who need to be supported the most. And I think that's what a Labour valued government would look to do, and clearly I think that is the way we should look to do things.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a very interesting area and an interesting cohort of people to trial this with, and yeah, you know, it's exciting stuff to see that there is now, of course, there is this general consensus that we need to at least trial it, and it's good to hear Mark Drakeford say that as well, particularly on the debate. So, what about you, Rhiannon? What are your thoughts on this?
I do think, and I think Mick has got a really good point here in terms of a definition of what we mean by UBI. And I think it does come back to some of the comments that have been made in your first question. It is about having a fairer system, a more redistributive system. And I do believe a lot of the answers are not held currently in terms of Welsh Government functionality. That is an issue for us. But putting that to one side, in terms of the radical shift that is needed to, and I hate to use the word level up, but you know, these words have been around previously. I do believe that we are now looking at a system that is absolutely broken in terms of welfare, in terms of the security that there should be for those who are often in the most difficult crises of their lives. So I think going back to the particular point that you've just made about where any trial should start or where any pilot should start. Yeah, I mean, I was really interested to hear what the First Minister said in regard to care leavers. And sometimes I do feel sorry for care leavers in terms of the focus that is upon them. But we also do know that we have issues there in terms of attainment, in terms of how we do create a better system for those that are in loco parentis as well. So I do think in terms of care leavers as a particular group, we know with individual pupil level data, we know that we've got an analysis, we've got pupil tracking, we know that there are systems and processes in place from school to under 25, whereby I can totally understand why we would want to use that in terms of evaluation and assessment to be able to see whether this would actually make a difference. And I actually do feel that it could make a radical difference in terms of this particular group. And then the wider question is, if that analysis and if that evaluation proves to make a radical difference, because let's be absolutely honest, despite interventions so far, we know that there is not a level playing field here, then the bigger question for us to ask really is where to next. And I think it would be really interesting, as Jack said, for those learned professors, rather than a layperson like myself in this regard, to be able to come up with some longitudinal study and see what is actually happening elsewhere in the world. Because for us in Wales today, it is about if this does prove to be successful, where to next?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if we have a substantive pilot as well in Wales, I think it really would put Wales on the map as well, wouldn't it? Any academic worth their salt would really want to have a look at that evaluation, which I think is incredibly exciting in itself. But you're absolutely right. There's so much that we can learn from it. Mick, I'm going to come to you next. So what are your thoughts on the idea?
Yeah, well, listen, the first thing is, when we talk about a trial, one of the things we've talked about is potentially looking at a geographic area on sort of poverty indices. We can see how that is really set for trauma in itself. Can you imagine setting up a system in one area, and then you have the situations that we all know arise? What about the person across the street who suddenly sees, etc.? I mean, it's something that is really potentially has so many pitfalls. The idea of doing something almost like a sectoral approach, and I like the idea of something like starting with care leaves that Jack and Mark have talked about. One, because we know very clearly what the challenges are socially in terms of the impact on life and life opportunities for care leavers, but also a very identifiable group of people. Where you could really evaluate what the impact might be by guaranteed an income and all the potential opportunities there would be in terms of education, in terms of training, in terms of setting up business or whatever, finding your feet for a period of time. So the devil still remains in the detail. But I'm certainly impressed with the idea that that is actually a really interesting way to start. And it's also something that is more definable in terms of cost. Because look, realistically, if we were in government in Westminster, and everything we've been saying about the appalling way in which universal credit, and you were to go back to basics, you might actually be able to do and say, look, let's actually look at something that is a complete overhaul of the system. All the levers, cutting out all the areas of bureaucracy, free education instead of part being on benefits. Can people afford to go to education or not? The part-time, all those different options of assessments, of means testing, and all those sorts of things. So I think, but we're not in that situation. And in any event, the implementation of that radical reform is really a decade's work, I think, in itself. We've seen how difficult universal credit is, and even with a fair wind and a government committed to the principles of what universal could and should have been, which is around the whole concept of a universal basic income, we're not there. The second thing is, to what extent might it be possible for Welsh Government to be able to engage with the DWP in the trial? That is significant, because if we could do something, if there was that willingness to explore, then there are real opportunities then of being far broader and far more radical in terms of how we might want to approach. You might want to actually pick a whole series of sectors of society that are actually entrenched into institutionalized into poverty, and provide a mechanism for people joining a minimum income scheme, etc. And then the question will be, what are the obligations upon that? So you have to think very carefully about that and the pitfalls on how that might work as well. The more likely alternative is going to be Welsh Government working in conjunction with probably local authorities on trying to define a number of groups, etc., where you can then evaluate what the real impact. If you go to these people and said, for 5 years now, you're going to have a guaranteed minimum income, this is going to come to you, etc. You can make of it what you will. There will be support mechanisms, there will be frameworks within, in terms of education, in terms of training, in terms of work, in terms of form of business or whatever. And then you evaluate that to be able to compare how that compares with what that similar grouping of people who have not been within that pilot have actually experienced. And I think that would be a really interesting in terms of alleviating poverty. The only trouble with it, of course, it's quite expensive. It's a lot of work. It's a long period of time, and you're still stuck with the fact that the majority of people are outside of that system. So all these things are quite long term. But I think the advantages to a trial is one, that you start the process of thought going in a practical way, and it doesn't stop you actually looking at what I think should really be the case, and that is, if we had control of all the levers and the resources and the finance and so on, what would we do in terms of a universal credit, of a minimum income for everyone? And also the most important thing that we mustn't miss that goes on, I think what ties in with this is the issue of the obligation of the state to ensure everyone has the opportunity of employment. There are many useful things that can go, but I think that commitment to full employment and for people to provide work and for the state to provide useful work, so many useful things we could be doing, I think become part and parcel of that picture. And I suppose ultimately at the end of the day, it's winning hearts and minds as well, because you've got to win consensus and also remember that many of the people who we are saying or suggesting might benefit from a universal basic income are going to be very, very suspicious, particularly in terms, and fearful in many, because we know many people already are raising concerns in terms of particularly those with disability and so on. So it has to be managed and thought through very, very carefully. I think it's very good that we have a sustainability commissioner in Sophie Howe, etc., who is almost the ideal department to actually be developing eyes from this. I know they're giving a lot of thought to this, and I think that might be the way to work forward with local government, with Welsh Government and with the Sustainability Commissioner, in order to actually not only develop a pilot, but also to develop a broader series of potential options that we can look at the detail of.
Yeah, and Sophie Howe's done some incredible work in advocating this, and of course, that she's worked with autonomy recently, and there's a paper due out pretty soon with that, and it's something that we helped out with as well, and we're really excited to see that. So it's really exciting times. And Dawn, last but not least,
thanks, Jonathan. Well, I think probably the first thing to say is that any trial is not UBI, is it? But by definition, it's not. It's not a universal basic income. It's a trial for a particular cohort, and whether that trial translates into and can be evaluated to the extent that it would prove its worth as a universal benefit is something that I don't think anybody can really say at this stage, because wherever there have been trials anywhere in the world, it's been with relatively small cohorts, and it's never gone on, from what I've read anyway, it's never really gone on from that to be universally adopted across a whole nation. And of course, different nations apply it very differently depending on whether they are, third world nations or whether they are first world nations like the USA that have run trials and so on. So I think that's important to say, that a trial is not UBI. But even when we've got an agreed cohort, so we're talking about in Wales the care leavers, and I think in the general scheme of things, when you look at groups of people that could potentially benefit from it, then that is a good group for all the reasons that my colleagues have already identified. But even with an agreed cohort, you still need to have a very clear insight into what the nub of the real and very practical challenges are in terms of introducing a trial. So if you were going to approach an experiment on UBI, you've got to answer some very specific questions. And this is not coming from me. This is something that I picked up from the Public Services International report, and they set some very core questions for any trial. They said, you've got to identify how often payments will be made, how much is going to be paid, where does the money come from? Mick's already touched on that. Where does the money come from? Who gets it? Is it conditional? I mean, I think some trials in other countries have identified, that there are certain conditions that you have to meet, like being a citizen or a resident of that country, and so on, and how payments then relate to other forms of social protection. And I think none of these things come without complication, do they? Because we've only got to look at the issues around that we had in Wales on a very small scale, where we tried to pay care staff 500 quid. And you start to see straight away, this was the pandemic bonus, if you remember, and you start to see how very quickly things become complicated when you want to do something that's the right thing to do, and then other levers of government say you can't do that. And so, we have to take all of that into account as well. And then I think again, I think it was Mick that did touch on this as well, is that we've got to consider whether, for whatever cohort we are talking about, is income the primary issue for some people, or is it debt, money, life management skills? And so it might be that it is about more than income. And again, money in and of itself, if there are lots of other issues that are involved in a person's life, just the money deals with one aspect of it, but it doesn't deal with every other aspect of somebody's individual circumstances. And I think that brings us on to, and this is a thread that runs through a lot of papers that I've read on UBI, is that we have to be careful that it doesn't become an individualistic solution to an issue, rather than a collective response, which those of us that are that have been born and bred and brought up in the collective, the kind of values of collectivism in the trade union movement and so on, we all believe in the principles of solidarity and collectivism, and that society as a whole has a responsibility for all of this. So is there a danger that UBI can be or could be seen as an individualistic solution to what is a wider societal problem? But for all of that, the current system ain't working, is it? So for all of that, we can't say that because we think that there are barriers and impediments and difficulties, and how do we pay for it, and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't try to address it, because at the end of the day, what we do have is, as the UK, we are part of a UK benefits system, which is actually a very socialist principle, isn't it? That you pool the resources and you tax the richest people in the country to help support those that don't have the broadest shoulders. So, if we do it for the current welfare and benefits system, which isn't working, why can't we use that kind of pooling of resources for a system that could work?
Yeah.
So, but those would be my thoughts around it, that it's not a panacea. It comes with lots of challenges, but it's got to be something that's worth experimenting with, because sure as hell the current system isn't working.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on some cracking points there, Dawn, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because there is, I think, a danger to a degree when you talk about trialing it with one particular sector, and of course by having that broader trial, for example, you will have that stronger empirical evidence, won't you? You will by looking at people in work poverty, people who are employment unemployed, for example. It's you would get all of this data that would allow us to learn that and so on. And I think that would be important. But of course, there's a cost to that then as well, isn't it? By having that huge experiment. So it's balancing that, and that's your guys' jobs as politicians to balance those issues. I'm conscious of the time, guys, and also I know that there's a lot of questions in the chat, and it's always great to get the audience involved. So I'll come to one question that we have left, and it's something that you've all touched on, and it's something that's definitely brought to our attention as well, and that's of course that you're going to have to get DWP on board with this. You're going to have to get the UK government on board with this if we're going to have a pilot in Wales. So I I suppose, how do we overcome those barriers? Because, you know, it's going to be pretty difficult to convince the likes of Boris perhaps to get on board with this. So how do we do that? And I'll come to you first, Nick, on that one. What do you think?
My view is, firstly, I think that wouldn't rule out completely that the DWP might be interested in a shared pilot if it is thought through carefully, and it's not necessarily a thing of sort of asking Boris and so on. I mean, there is that risk that the Tories would just say that we're not interested in any of this because of the particular rather nasty sort of politics that have been emerging over the past few years, and particularly the past decade. So I actually do think that we go down that route and we don't rule it out, etc. We try and work for it. We try and develop an idea of how we might work with the DWP to achieve something. I'm sure that it would be possible to have discussions, and it would be possible to have people who have expertise in this area to come together if the parameters are set right. But I don't want to put all, I think there has to be that can't be the sort of sole approach. And if it doesn't happen, then, oh dear, we can't do anything. And I think that's why we come back to the idea of how Welsh government can actually work with a local authority with a defined targeted area. In the chat room, I see the arguments over whether it should be all of Wales, whether it should be a geographical area. Of course, that raises all those questions of how broad the geographical area should be, the complications of what happens if whether you're just topping up someone, but the fact that we know for the existing benefit system, you top up someone's income to give them a basic income, and immediately the benefit system claws it back and pulls it out again. So there are all those particular complications. That's why there has to be a certain amount of cooperation. So the idea that we can actually design something that's very specifically doesn't cost UK government, but where UK government will not penalise. Now, if that could be achieved, I think that would open the door in terms of the range of potential schemes that we could have. Otherwise, I think we very much are looking at something like care leavers and so on in terms of trial, because you could actually do that on a universal basis across Wales. You could actually then evaluate it, and it would be within probably the affordability. It would still be expensive. You're still talking about tens of millions of pounds, but it would still be something that might be affordable for Welsh government in conjunction with local authorities to actually do themselves. And in actual fact, it might be possible even to evaluate that there are savings from being able to do that would then perhaps open the door to a more expansive approach. So those are the way. I mean, I don't have any simple answer to it, only that is my thinking as to how we would start the approach going through it, designing a whole series of different options and discussions and so on that need to go around that. We really are at the basic. What we've won so far is the agreement that, and even I think Tories on more, that somehow we have to do something radically different to eliminate poverty. The difference is, of course, what we're saying is a lot of that actually boils down to things like redistribution of wealth and greater equalization within society. Otherwise, it becomes unaffordable. So I think the actual trial of it and winning hearts and minds from such a trial is what is fundamentally important.
And I think you've raised two important points there. One is the ecology of ideas, isn't it? That, we shouldn't perhaps focus on one particular idea. It might be good to have a plethora of ideas. And two, I think, and this is forgotten in the basic income debate, is the savings this could have, particularly on mental, if you're looking at physical and mental well-being, then of course, you have a significant saving on the health services, and they're at, they are finding a difficult time at these times at the moment anyway. So, two very important points there, Mick, I think. Dawn, what about you? What do you think?
I'm not convinced that the DWP will buy into this. I hope I'm wrong, but I think that this is something that Welsh government are going to have to look at how they can finance themselves, and that in itself is going to be a huge challenge, because we all understand how Welsh government is funded. you know, we do to a large extent depend on the money that comes down from Westminster, although Welsh Government does have reserves and all that sort of thing. So, you know, I think that is something, you know, that's almost the starting point, isn't it? Is how does it get funded? But if we are going to have to make the case, because, you know, even if the government agrees in principle that we do this, I think there is still an awful lot of work that has to be done before we can enter into a trial. And I think there needs to be some consensus that we build, not just across the Senedd, but in our communities as well. So I think that, you know, to get this off the ground, I think we probably do need to have like a Senedd inquiry into this. So, you know, we're quite adept at doing this. All of our committees conduct inquiries all the time. And we could have a Senedd inquiry that gathers evidence. We could ask Welsh Government to come in and submit their views. And so we could scrutinise what they think on the issue. We could even set up something like a citizens jury or a community development model to test some of these ideas. It was one of the things that when I was the chair of the Senedd Reform Committee, we were hoping that we could set up some kind of citizens assembly to test those ideas about expanding the size of the Senedd and all the other things that needed to go along with Senedd reform, to test that with the public. And then unfortunately the pandemic came along, so we weren't able to do that. But I think this is something that we could do, you know, a very detailed piece of work that is evidence-based, so that as we go into a trial, we go into that trial with evidence and with some kind of consensus and consent, if you like, from the communities that we're looking to support in all of this. So that would be my kind of thought about how we start to progress it, because, you know, it just seems to me without some kind of evidence base, we've got to feed into a Senedd budget process at some point. And, you know, no government of any colour is just going to sign a blank cheque, is going to want an evidence base for something that they're looking to do. Even if the outcome of that is somewhat unknown, we've got to have some kind of rationale for getting into it in the first place. So I think the Senedd would want to do its own piece of work on that, I think, before entering into a trial. That would be my view.
I think having an inquiry or commission or something along those lines, you know, it would help get the idea into the public consciousness as well, wouldn't it? Because
I think so, yeah.
There's not a lot of people that know about it. Of course, it's become a mainstream idea now, but I think there was a Times Radio poll that said only 8% of people actually know what a UBI is.
Yeah.
And I think a SPAD was better known than UBI, although perhaps Dominic Cummins had something to do with that and the palaver with last summer. Rhiannon, what's your thoughts?
Some really interesting points, and it's like being back in committee and we're not able to interject. So we're being very disciplined here for us politicians. Look, we already have a universal solution to work poverty, and that is working tax credits, or tax credits are the threshold that's a minimum guarantee. We don't need to reinvent the wheel on some of these things. What would be interesting is when we do have a trial and when we do get that evaluated properly, you know, I'm more than happy to go along the lines of an inquiry. I'm just more concerned about timelines and timescales in terms of the developing need in this regard. It's how we can encapsulate what we know already works, right? We know some things already work with this concept. And I do actually think, you know, in regard to the real elephant in the room here, and a number of people have touched upon this, because at the heart of this is fair funding, right? Fair funding for Wales. As some people have touched upon this already, is, you know, we have to look at this in the round. We do not want to make people poorer. We do not want to set communities against communities, objective 1 cohorts against objective 4 cohorts in terms of former geographical groups. So there is a real conflict and tension here, isn't there, in terms of the trial versus a cohort trial versus the geographical concept, and what some are calling the universal concept in terms of whether it's child benefit or pensions as we move forward. So yeah, we obviously underscore the need that we need to look at this in detail. We need to evaluate the benefit and the disadvantage from this, but we already know some things already work, and those levers are with the UK government, and we cannot do this without DWP on board. And this is where politics actually is not a dirty word. Politics matters, and those governments that want to pursue these types of redistributive policy baskets are really, really important to driving this forward. So that's all I'm going to say on that particular point. But I do actually think, sorry, my real point is this. This is going to be expensive, okay? This is going to be expensive. There is absolutely no way that the Welsh budget is going to absorb this universally across Wales without the UK putting money in. Otherwise, we, in my view, will be making ourselves poorer. So this has to be done with proper intergovernmental communication. And at this moment in time, there is no system for the UK Treasury to sit down with Wales to discuss the Barnett formula or the lack of infrastructural investment in Wales. We have to have those mechanisms in place.
Yeah, absolutely, and you're absolutely right, and perhaps the devolution of those powers might be the answer. What do you think, Jack? What's your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Jonathan. I think colleagues have set their thoughtful answers out, haven't they? Really, and agree with that. I think we need to be honest about this, don't we? A UBI, a full rollout of a UBI, is clearly going to need the support of a UK government. I think that let's get that straight now. I think it needs to be understood. We need to be honest, and we need to accept that. And I think some who perhaps don't accept that aren't living in reality. And I think that we should set that record straight from the start when we're talking about this. I think the more realistic approach for a trial then clearly is if the Welsh government can find a way of funding it themselves. And Mick mentioned a couple of options there, and that we can't be saying right now this is the way forward, and then that is the only way, because we don't know. Quite frankly, the answer is we don't know yet. It's got to be. We need to explore the ideas of how this is feasible. But living in reality, I think it is feasible for the Welsh government to fund a trial like the trial that we've discussed earlier this evening. I mean, for me, one of the key barriers, and I'm not going over the points that colleagues have already raised, because they've raised obviously some really good points, but we have to look at leadership as well. So obviously the Senedd has got a role to play in this and wherever we take this in the future, but we have to look at leadership. And let's look over the last week or so. No one in leadership, in my opinion, has been more positive than Mark Drakeford when he said about a trial. So, if you want a trial of a UBI, then there's a clear indication of which way to vote. And again, we in the Senedd took the idea of a universal basic income trial. I did it as a backbench member of the Labour Party with colleagues here who supported that. So I think, warm words from other areas are great, but this is going to take sheer leadership to get there. We've started a movement, you've started a movement, and everyone on the call today, we had that debate in the Senedd. It was a positive debate. It needs that next step now. So I think there's a couple of things how we get over barriers, isn't it? First one's being honest, and then the second one's showing a bit of courage and leadership. And I think that's what we can have in Wales. And we have to be realistic at the fact that it will, for a full universal basic income, need a UK government support. And I just want to end really because of a question of why. And you mentioned the Radio 4 piece and the Today programme. And I had a question of why. I don't think it got aired on the interview, but during that piece I did with the journalist, they said, well, why do you need this? And it was as if you need some real complex answer. Well, actually, the reality of it, the situation is, before coronavirus, before lockdown, we are all held advice surgeries face to face. It wouldn't be uncommon for me to have someone crying over their experience of the benefit system, whether that not being able to get on, whether that be the experience with PIP. It could be a numerous amount of things, but it would not be uncommon. And, I could perhaps quantify it on average every 2 weeks. I would have someone crying. Now, if that doesn't tell you that system's not working and we have to do something, and if the UK government the current UK government as they are now do not want to step up to the plate to look at how we can do something different, then in Wales we will.
Thanks for that, Jack. Really powerful stuff there. So we'll go to the audience, and I think there's a few questions in the chat as well. So I'll try and find those. But I note that Patricia has had a hand up. So Patricia, I think we're going to ask you to unmute yourself, and if you wanted to come in and ask your question, then please, by all means, fire away.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Loud and clear, Patricia.
Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a question, but, you know, all I can say is that I've had, like a lot of people, a really bad time on benefits. There's been a number of times I've been sanctioned for something that wasn't my fault. I'm currently in work now. I work in a care home, independent living support worker, on minimum wage. I'm 63 and I've had a life in work and quite a long time on benefits too. I was a carer for my mum. No one told me that I could be a carer. I had to find out the hard way how to claim carer's allowance. And yeah, I mean, the universal basic income, when I first heard that through members of the Green Party, when they spoke about the citizens' income, I thought, I've died and gone to heaven. Yeah, so I don't have a question about how it's going to work. I just hope that it will work. And I think it's something that would be really good, a real good alternative to a benefit system that that hasn't been working for poor people that really need it.
I agree.
Thanks, Patricia. Does any of our panel have anything that they'd like to come in on that? Anything to add at all?
I'd just like to say, oh.
Sorry, go on, Rhiannon.
I mean, you can't listen to Patricia without, hearing, what's behind that story. I get very angry every time, and Jack has touched upon this. We as politicians see virtually, in every single surgery, somebody who's actually been traumatized by sanctions, and although this is not, a devolved issue, we are dealing with citizens who are broken by the benefit system. And I think, one of the very strong plus points for looking at this issue, and this is why I'm talking to you today, is that, we have to use the levers that we have in our control to the best possible financial advantage for our people. And it is so distressing to just listen to some of these stories, and in particular what Patricia has touched upon. And we just have to make sure that we do what we possibly can in this regard. And I think this is an idea that is worth trialing, it's worth looking at, but quite frankly, at the end of the day, it is not right that the UK welfare benefit system is doing this to its own system, to its own citizens, and in my view, harming its own citizens.
Dawn, did you want to come in on that?
Well, it was only just to say, really kind of echo some of the things that Rhiannon was saying. I mean, Patricia's absolutely right, and as and as Jack has said, we see this, in our offices, in our advice surgeries all the time, and the status quo just isn't an option, is it? And so, it is just about looking at how this can change. The benefit system, as we've already heard, is not devolved. I mean, one of the committees that I sit on, the Equalities, Local Government and Communities Committee, did an inquiry into devolution of benefits, and how we could have that system within a UK benefit system, because it is a hugely expensive system. I think we should remember that, and that is why being part of a UK benefit system is the right, in my view, is the right thing to do, because the cost of it is more equitably spread. I think we would struggle to have a benefit system like that if we were just trying to finance it as a country of 3 million people. So I think, you know, that's part of that debate as well. But the benefit system as we have it, the pooling of resources is there to make it better, but we don't have a system that works at the moment. So, you know, we have to do something about addressing that, and that's been, you know, it's been true of successive governments. This isn't, you know, this particular Tory government is pretty poor, is pretty bad at this, you know, what they've introduced. But, you know, we've had successive governments over the years that haven't really sought to address this in any meaningful way. So, you know, the time is right for that sort of change.
Thanks, Tom. Does anybody else want to come in on that, or shall I move on to another question?
Well, I would just add to that, and you know, we are where we are today, but we do know that working tax credits made a real inroad in terms of what is now called in-work poverty. That is one lever that the UK government does have under its control, and it is decided strategically to diminish something that was working. So again, it's not about reinventing some of those wheels, is it?
Jack, I've seen you want to come in.
Yeah, very quickly, Jonathan, all I would say is, you know, we've sat here today. You've done a number of these events, haven't you, before this one? I think they said this was your last. 4 politicians here today talking about this idea. Patricia comes in at the end with a lived experience and blows us out the water.
Yeah.
You know, quite frankly, because, you know, someone with that lived experience, I always thought, you know, going into politics, and I've got asked this question loads of times, well, what do you know? Well, actually, lived experience goes a far further way than reading in a book, for example, or doing this. So I think one of the important things that we must focus on when we do, you know, look at delivering a trial on a universal basic income and how that works going forward is clearly listening to the people who it will affect on the you know, on the front line, on the ground, who it will help, or who will it, you know, we don't want to do this and get it wrong. So I think it's listening to people like Patricia, listening to care leavers, if that's the trial that we're going to do, and see how that could really help them. So I think it's you know, the lived experience from Patricia there, you know, it goes some way. And I think getting involved with today's events for someone like Patricia and your other colleagues on the call is a fantastic way forward. And I think that's how we deliver it together.
Yeah. Mick, you wanted to jump in there?
Well, I was actually just going to say, we actually had, I mean, Gordon Brown did introduce a form of UBI in respect of pensioners, and that was there was going to be a guaranteed income, etc. Now, they've got a category of people, the majority of whom are not working, but it was effectively applied universally, and that is, it was saying that you know, once you've retired, once you've reached a certain age, you should be entitled to a certain guaranteed income. And I remember it because my mum was in Denmark, and people talk how wonderful a Scandinavian system. We actually brought her back here because she was better off here under that system than when she was in Denmark. So the idea that somehow this, you know, has not been done, you know, in some ways, I suppose you could say the pensioners thing was a sort of trial. It's just it was done in a different environment, and I think it does give an argument, though, that, you know, it can be done, it has been done, and the universality of benefits is something we really have to promote much more than we have been.
Thanks, Mick. So I'm going to jump to another question in the chat, and it's a pretty hot topic, and I think it does feed into what we've been discussing this evening in terms of whether or not we'll get TWP on board and whether or not we can overcome those barriers, and that is, if we can't get Westminster to agree, does this push UBI advocates towards independence? And I suppose I would say not just advocates, but people who really like the idea. Do they start getting, you know, pushed towards that independence argument if they think that Westminster can't deliver it, or a UK government can't deliver it? So, and Mick, I know you've done a lot on this with the radical federalism, so I'll come to you on this first. So far away.
Well, listen, I'm actually going to be quite simple on it. I mean, first it depends what you mean by independence and how you define it, and I won't go in there. That's another complicated argument. But look, Welsh taxes raised something like £18 billion. That is the equivalent. That is effectively the budget of the Senedd, the actual social welfare thing that is not, and those areas that are not covered, amount to 10 billion. There is a 10 billion deficit. If we tomorrow were to completely separate from the UK, we'd have to find 10 billion pounds, 10 billion. Now that is why there is a dilemma over this, and questions that have to be asked and answered as to how we approach this. That is why it isn't a simple solution. Well, if only we did this, therefore we'd be free to do with whatever we want. The fact of the matter is that the importance of that, for all its faults, the importance of the Barnet redistribution and the welfare funding is still something that is vitally important. It is inadequate for all the reasons that we actually know, but it does amount to a considerable amount of money that we could not afford to be without. The question for us is how we actually use it better. And how we actually increase it and have a better distribution of wealth. That's why distribution of wealth is so important within it. But independence is not an answer to this.
Yeah. Anybody else want to jump in on that at all?
I agree absolutely with what Mick is just saying. I think that was what I was alluding to in my previous answer about being part of a UK social network, if you like, a social benefit system. That we just could not afford to do that at the moment. If Wales was on its own. So I think, you know, it's a bit of a distraction to the bigger issue. I just think, you know, we have much bigger fish to be frying at the moment, and dealing with something like this is one of them.
Jack, I'm going to come to you next, and then Rhiannon, I'll come to you. I know you wanted to jump in. You're on mute, Jack. That famous 2023.
Yeah. I knew it. Someone would do it. But thanks, Jonathan. And I agree with Dawn and Mick. And Mick's doing some really, really good work around this agenda. But I think in simple terms is, you know, if you want a government that can work together, then my message to UBI advocates would be vote for a Labour government in the next general election. You know, a government that will work with the Welsh Labour government and actively seek to do that. So that's what, instead of what we've got now in Boris and all the, you know, I don't need to get into that because I think people can make their own mind up and will make their own mind up. But that's me. I don't think independence is the route to this. I think Mick's answered it and Dawn's answered it in a very thorough way. But in simple terms, you know, elect a government in Westminster that will work with a Welsh Labour government in the Senedd. Change
the driver, not the bus.
I like that, Dawn. I might keep that one.
Change the driver, not the bus. Yeah, I mean, I think my colleagues have sort of succinctly put into play the words that are in my head in regards to my thinking. But I mean, just going back on what Mick has said in regard to the 10 billion deficit, and what I've said at the very beginning is what we do here is of critical importance to the poorest people in society. And what we do know, and there have been some concerns raised in Scotland in this regard, we cannot make people worse off. And we're going to be 10 billion worse off if we carry on the mantle in Wales as we currently understand it. But that's with the current level of chronic scarcity of funding for those who are at the bottom. And we want to improve that. We want to do more. So that 10 billion is not and should not stay at 10 billion. And these are fundamental questions. And I go back to this particular point. We're on 2010 finances for Wales in 2021. And, you know, quite frankly, we have to get those into government mechanisms of discussion, debate around our finances and fairer funding for Wales so that we start at a level playing field in that regard. And I do not believe heading into an independent Republic of Wales will do anything but give us less finances so that we can level the playing field for all of our citizens.
Thanks, Rhiannon. So those last two questions, the chat has gone very lively, and I don't think I'm going to be able to find the questions now and there. So I'm going to open it up. If anybody wants to raise their hand, ask a question. I don't know, if, Patricia, if you've got your hand raised again, or it's just still raised. No, I think it's gone down now. There we go. So if there's no other questions, I think I'll wrap it up because, of course, our guests probably want to get off now. It's pretty late. And I haven't had my tea yet, actually, either. So I just wanted to say thank you, guys, for coming along this evening. It's been a fantastic chat. It's been really interesting to get your insights. And of course, thanks so much for supporting our pledge campaign as well. It's been great to have you on board with that. I don't know if anyone wants to say anything before we sort of wrap it up at all, or I think we probably said perhaps enough this evening, all talked out to give your voices a rest. You know,
if anyone says anything now, you see, it will just trigger another discussion.
We'll start again, and that's not good.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So on that note, thanks ever so much for coming along. Thanks to everyone who's watching on YouTube and on Facebook and who's joined the chat this evening. It's been a pleasure to have you. Yeah, and I see there's a few clapping hands there. I'll think those are probably for me. But I'll leave you all go. Thanks so much, guys. Really enjoyed it, and have a great evening. And good luck with your election campaigns as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Good night, all. Good night.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.